She sat in the wrong seat, not by accident, not by confusion. She sat where Kate was meant to sit, beside the king, in full view of foreign delegates, live cameras, and the man who noticed immediately. Prince William didn't confront her. He didn't raise his voice. He raised 2 fingers, barely visible. And that's when everything stopped. The royal guard stepped into the aisle, mid-ceremony, and said just 5 words. "This seat is reserved." Camilla didn't stand, not right away. So the guard made her, not violently, not politely, just publicly. Because in the monarchy, when protocol is broken, silence becomes a command. And the guard doesn't ask twice. And if you think that's bold, wait until you see what happened after she was removed. Tap, like if you felt that shift. Subscribe for stories where power doesn't shout, it moves. And turn on the bell icon because the next one might be even quieter, but you'll feel it. The hall wasn't built for conflict. It was built for sequence, for procession. The kind of place where everything had its place, where marble echoed in even measures, where chairs lined up perfectly to the inch, where nothing moved unless it was meant to, and nothing happened that hadn't been rehearsed. It was one of those late-morning ceremonies Kensington hosted sparingly, enough to be rare, not enough to be spectacle. A commemorative seating for international guests, charitable recognitions, and a state presentation across both diplomatic and cultural lines. Cameras were permitted, the press was present, and the event, while light on consequence, was dense with symbolism. That's why everything had to be exact. Uniforms were already in place by the time the guests arrived. Red ceremonial tunics for the guards at rear formation, dark dress uniforms for palace aides. The front row seating bore name plaques that would never be spoken aloud. Everyone already knew where they were supposed to be. The guard never announced these details. They executed them. Behind the final row, positioned at rigid intervals, stood the watching eyes of Kensington's invisible framework, protection officers, protocol secretaries, event marshals. None of them spoke. They didn't have to. The room functioned like a watch on winding tension, balanced, precise, silent. At exactly 10:41, the king entered, flanked by 2 royal aides, and seated himself at the ceremonial centre. 2 seats to the right remained empty. They were not empty by mistake. One was for the Princess of Wales. The other, by tradition, by precedent, and by countless sealed orders from decades prior, was for the heir apparent. Prince William would sit closest to the king on the right. Catherine would sit 1 seat further, balancing the arrangement. No one in the front row needed to be told this. But then again, no one expected it to be violated either. At 10:47, Queen Camilla arrived. She did not enter with the king. She came by separate corridor. Not late, just staggered. And when she walked down the aisle, her expression held no friction, no smugness, no claim. Just a gentle half smile and the kind of glide that meant everything was already arranged. She did not pause before taking her seat. She simply sat, right next to the king, in the chair marked for Catherine. There was no whisper, no gasp, no sound at all. Because no one in that hall had ever rehearsed what to do if the wrong person sat in the right seat. At first, it didn't look intentional. Camilla's hand drifted to the side of the armrest, adjusting something invisible. A necklace pendant. A sleeve. Something to fill the half-second that passed before aides began, quietly, adjusting themselves. Not visibly, not outwardly, just the small movements people make when the plan has gone off by half an inch, and there's no protocol in place to pull it back. One aide took a step forward and then stopped. Another began to turn, before catching herself mid-motion. The second row froze. The third waited for cue, and there was no cue, because no one had expected a violation to occur without resistance. The king didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't show it. He remained forward-facing, clasped hands resting on his lap, eyes not wandering to the right where Camilla now sat, exactly where the Princess of Wales was meant to be. The air didn't break. It tightened. At the rear of the hall, 2 uniformed royal guards remained in position. They didn't move. They didn't blink. Their presence was ornamental until it wasn't. The camera operators, trained for angles, not politics, lingered too long on the front row. It wasn't until the senior floor director gave a subtle throat-clear signal that the broadcast view shifted slightly. Too late. Everyone watching had seen. At 10:49, Prince William entered. He walked alone. No aides, no entourage, no spouse at his side. That wasn't abnormal. The heir's entrance was often solo. But something about his pace, measured but firm, landed differently this time. He didn't look toward the cameras. He didn't look toward the crowd. He looked only at the front row. 1 second. 2. And then his eyes found the chair where Catherine should have been. Found Camilla sitting there instead. He stopped walking. No one spoke. No one moved. No one breathed. Because in a room built to operate like a machine, something had just broken. The pause wasn't announced. It simply happened. Not long enough to be called a disruption. Not loud enough to be noticed by anyone watching at home who hadn't been trained in ceremonial rhythm. But for those in the room, for anyone who had ever attended a royal function, the gap was unmistakable. William had stopped walking. He didn't speak, didn't frown, didn't look over his shoulder toward the aides frozen near the edge of the aisle. He just didn't keep moving. And in the front row, Camilla still hadn't shifted. She didn't glance back, didn't feign surprise, didn't even blink. Her hand remained resting lightly against the curved end of the armrest, fingers draped casually. A woman entirely at ease, too at ease. The chair she occupied had not been assigned to her. Everyone knew it. Every private secretary, every aide-de-camp, every equerry tasked with line of succession protocol had seen the layout in triplicate. It was protocol, and protocol in a room like this wasn't decoration. It was function, it was law, it was message. Because in a royal seating chart, the order didn't just reflect tradition, it defined it. The heir's spouse does not sit beside the sovereign. She sits beside the heir. Unless something has shifted, unless someone has claimed space, they weren't given. William resumed walking. He didn't rush, he didn't delay. He simply moved again, 6 more steps, until he reached the row. But instead of stepping in, he remained standing, not blocking the aisle, not obstructing the view, just standing, still, at full height. The seats were ready, but he didn't sit. A ripple passed down the line of aides again. A few looked toward the floor. One adjusted his cuff. Another touched her earpiece. But no one dared act on their own, not without direction, not in a moment like this. Because if they misread it, they would become the story. And this room was built to prevent stories from forming. Still, the ceremony couldn't proceed, not yet. The event coordinator, seated discreetly near the south entrance, shifted uneasily in her chair. Her clipboard rested uselessly in her lap. The host's voice, a prominent cultural liaison, could be heard faintly rehearsing the opening remarks under his breath. He hadn't been cued yet. Because the cue hadn't come. Because the seat was still wrong. Kate hadn't entered, not because she was late, not because she wasn't present. She was waiting, just out of frame, beyond the eastern archway. A second entrance, reserved for instances where the Princess of Wales entered after the sovereign and the heir. She should have emerged the moment William reached the row, but she hadn't, because the chair she was meant to take was occupied. She waited because sitting anywhere else would have made the breach real. The cameras caught none of it directly, only the long, slow pan across the dignitaries, the gentle swell of the live chamber music, the hum of a ceremony teetering on the edge of rhythm. Still, anyone paying attention could feel it. Something had gone still in the room, and not frozen, not broken, just held. One aide leaned forward behind a program. "She'll move after the anthem," he whispered to his counterpart. But the other aide didn't respond, because he knew what the first one didn't. There was no anthem scheduled. This wasn't the kind of event that offered a musical pause. It was meant to begin cleanly, directly. William and Kate seated. Host begins. Doors close. Procession moves. Any delay now would be felt across the whole structure. Not visibly, but in the substructure. Because if protocol could be bent once, it could be bent again. William still hadn't sat down. He didn't glance at the king. He didn't look to the waiting officials. He didn't meet Camilla's gaze. He just stood, 2 seats away from the throne, 1 seat away from where his wife was meant to be. And then, quietly, so quietly that even those near the front might have missed it, he raised 2 fingers. Not high, not dramatically, just 2 fingers low beside his thigh, palm down, as if adjusting his cuff. A signal, subtle, measured, not born of anger, just enough to be seen by exactly 1 person. The guard, still posted at the rear wall, eyes front, motionless in red and black, until, without hesitation or break in pace, he moved, 1 step forward, then 2, not rushed, not loud, but enough to make every other sound in the room stop. It would have been easier, safer, for most in the room to pretend the chair didn't matter. After all, it was just a seat, identical in design to the one beside it. Same wood, same upholstery, same embroidered trim curling beneath the brass pins. Nothing on it to mark it as Kate's, no placard, no crest. To the untrained eye, it could have been any seat in the line. But to those who understood the choreography of monarchy, it wasn't just furniture, it was position. And in a room like this, position was power, not through force, through order. Because order is how the palace breathes. Catherine's chair wasn't beside the king by courtesy or tradition. It was beside her husband for a reason. By formal arrangement, the Princess of Wales is the consort of the heir. She sits 1 seat away from the sovereign, not beside him. That single space gap, that's the crown's firewall. To cross it uninvited is to recode the institution in plain sight. No words required, just an occupied seat. And Camilla had occupied it. Not aggressively, not even obviously, but with intent. The kind of intent that doesn't ask permission, because it's already made peace with apology, should it come to that. But apology wouldn't come, because William hadn't given her the chance to offer one. He hadn't looked at her. He hadn't given her a moment to correct. He had signalled the guard instead, and that changed everything, because now the breach was formal. And if the chair had seemed ambiguous a minute ago, it wasn't anymore. The chair had become a line. Kate still hadn't entered, and she wouldn't, not until the protocol was restored. Because if she took another seat, even briefly, the precedent would calcify instantly. Every photo taken that morning would go out with that single narrative. Camilla beside the king, Catherine elsewhere. And it wouldn't matter that it wasn't authorised. It wouldn't matter that it was momentary. In royal architecture, perception creates permanence. Even William's aides didn't fully understand what would happen next. No one did. That's how rare the signal was. 2 fingers, subtle, quick, downward. A signal not used in 5 years. Because it wasn't for optics, it was for correction. The kind of correction that happens when policy won't act fast enough, and decorum is being used against itself. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the truth sat uncomfortably in every staff member's mind. This wasn't about a chair, it was about what that chair meant. The public wouldn't see the breach as insubordination. They'd see it as normal, as natural, as if it had always been this way, because royal optics don't scream. They settle, slowly, subtly, 1 image at a time, 1 seat at a time. And Camilla had understood that, had counted on it. She hadn't said a word when she sat down. She didn't need to. She had claimed placement. And in a world where positioning meant lineage, where every photo becomes part of the legacy's subconscious scaffolding, placement is everything. Which is why Kate didn't move. Which is why William didn't speak. Which is why the guard was now walking, 1 precise step at a time, down the central aisle of the ceremonial chamber, past cameras, past aides, past an audience that had finally realised something was off. No one had announced a disruption, but the body of the room knew. You could hear it in the scrape of a boot on marble, the stutter in the breath of a foreign ambassador, the sharp pause in the host's voice as he caught sight of the movement in the corner of his eye. Correction had been summoned, and it was arriving in full ceremonial red. He hadn't spoken a word. Not when he entered, not when he stopped, not when he saw the chair. William had simply stood there, shoulders square, head high, eyes forward. And for a few long seconds, that stillness said more than anything he could have voiced. Because the rules didn't require volume, they required conviction. And in moments like this, volume could betray conviction. He didn't raise an eyebrow. He didn't make a show of glancing at Camilla. He didn't sigh or shake his head or let emotions seep into the moment. He just stood. And then, when it was clear that the situation would not correct itself, he made a choice. It wasn't a command in words. It wasn't a call for aids or a gesture to the king. It was two fingers, lowered slightly at his side, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't been trained to look for it. Two fingers, extended briefly, palm angled down. The subtlest deviation from posture, gone in less than a second. But that second was enough, because to the guard watching from the perimeter, that signal wasn't ambiguous. It didn't invite interpretation. It didn't need clarification, and it was known. And its meaning was simple. Intervene. Now. Formally. It was a signal created for contingencies, rare, sharp moments where optics must remain clean, but control must reassert itself immediately. A gesture used so infrequently that some senior staffers had never seen it delivered in person. But today, William had used it, without emotion, without ceremony, without fear. He had relied on the one thing left untouched by personality or politics: protocol. It wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about asserting dominance. It was about something far simpler, restoring alignment. Because in this space, during this ceremony, alignment wasn't optional. It was the entire premise. The guard had already begun to move, flawlessly timed. Not rushed, not hesitant. Each step like a gear engaging inside a watch. The aisle cleared naturally, guests adjusting with small movements, barely turning their heads. And still, William didn't move. He didn't follow the guard. He didn't issue a second gesture. He just stood there, silent, waiting, watching, because the signal had been given. And now, the institution would handle it. The guard moved like a blade through cloth, smooth, precise, impossible to ignore once noticed. 1 step from the wall, 2 into the aisle, 3 past the ceremonial flower arrangement that marked the aisle's midpoint. The noise in the room didn't rise and it dropped, because movement like that, unscripted movement, in a royal ceremony, didn't signal adjustment. It signaled correction. No one whispered. No one needed to. Even those seated farthest from the front row could feel it. Something had breached, and the machine was realigning, not with sound, not with spectacle, but with presence. Camilla shifted for the first time. Not much. A small glance upward, a twitch of the hand still resting on the armrest. But it was there. Recognition. Because she had seen it too. How the red of the guard's tunic didn't stop at the aisle's edge, how it continued forward, slow, deliberate, irreducible. The guard did not shout. He did not bow. He stopped 3 feet from her and said calmly, "This seat is reserved." 5 words. Neutral tone. No inflection beyond clarity. It echoed in the hall, not because of volume, but because of what it disrupted. The king's face didn't change. William didn't blink. Kate remained out of sight, just beyond the archway. And Camilla turned slightly in her seat, the way someone does when they're still deciding whether to dismiss a waiter or confront a clerk. Her smile returned, not wide, not warm, but the kind designed for moments that need diffusing. "This is fine," she said quietly, almost pleasantly. "I'm already here. We can adjust afterward." The guard didn't respond, not out of rudeness, out of discipline. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was institutional. Behind the camera bank, the broadcast director made a sharp slashing motion, cutting from the wide shot to a neutral emblem close-up. The feed didn't cut entirely, but it stopped showing the front row. Because the story had changed. And Kensington didn't like visual ambiguity. Camilla's hand curled slightly around the armrest. Her smile tightened. "This is a misunderstanding," she tried again. "We can sort it after the ceremony." The guard's voice remained unchanged. "This seat is reserved." No escalation. No improvisation. Just repetition. pure procedural. A murmur passed through the seated rows now. Not scandal, not outrage. Recalibration. As if the very act of stating the boundary twice had confirmed it wasn't about optics anymore, it was about structure. Camilla looked to the king now, just briefly, a glance, a touch of appeal, but he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't rescue, because even he knew this wasn't personal, this was architecture, and the structure was correcting itself. Still, Camilla didn't rise, and her posture straightened, her fingers tightened around the carved wood. She adjusted her coat at the shoulder, not urgently, not defensively, but in a gesture of anchoring. She had decided she would not stand. She would not yield, not unless made to. And so she was. The guard didn't reach for her. He didn't touch her arm, didn't issue another verbal command. He merely raised one hand precisely and nodded once to the secondary guard stationed at the far end of the hall. Another signal, this one rehearsed. The second guard began to walk. It took 12 seconds. 12 seconds for the hall to fill with the sound of echoing boots, for every head to turn in sequence, for every aide to instinctively reach for a protocol binder that wouldn't help. When the second guard arrived, the two flanked Camilla's chair, not blocking her, framing her. She looked between them, and then, finally, up at William, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the chair, still empty, still waiting. And that was answer enough. Camilla's jaw clenched. But the moment had passed. There was no statement to make. No gesture that wouldn't look reactive. No recourse that wouldn't fracture what little legitimacy the move had hoped to claim. She stood. Not loudly, not angrily, but as someone who had just been reminded that presence is not power. Position is. The second guard adjusted the chair, nudging it half an inch to realign the row. The first guard stepped aside. Camilla walked, measured, silent, down the aisle she hadn't entered through. No words spoken, no glances exchanged, just footsteps. Behind her, the seat remained still for a moment, and then Kate entered. Camilla's departure didn't need to be declared. It had already happened the moment she stood. She didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't glance back toward the sovereign's chair, because saying anything now, anything at all, would only validate the moment as a confrontation, and she couldn't afford that. Not in front of this room, not in front of the international guests, not with a dozen cameras still discreetly rolling from 3 discrete angles. So she did what one does when the protocol wins. She left. The guards didn't follow her. They didn't need to. She wasn't being detained, she was being excluded. And in rooms like this, exclusion is far more permanent than punishment. Kate's entrance was silent. No music, no announcement. She stepped in from the east archway, her heels making a soft, crisp cadence on the marble floor as she approached. She didn't look to William, didn't break stride, didn't so much as glance toward the audience, many of whom had now turned their heads just slightly, just enough to register that the chair beside the king was no longer in question. She reached the row, turned, Saturday. No visible pause, no subtle adjustment, just one fluid motion, as if the seat had always been hers, because it was. The second guard returned to post. The first remained a moment longer, turning slightly, no more than 2 degrees, to confirm the line was restored, that every chair in the front row was now aligned, that no figures stood out of rhythm, that the symmetry had returned. Only then did he step back. One step, then another, rejoining his original position against the chamber wall. No expression, no change in bearing, just the machine, snapping cleanly back into sync. The host took his cue 2 beats later than scheduled. He stepped to the lectern, shuffled his notes, cleared his throat. Your Majesties, Your Royal Highnesses, esteemed guests, thank you for joining us. His voice filled the space like protocol had re-inhaled. The ceremony resumed. The cameras returned to wide angle. But no one missed what had just happened, not entirely, because the applause that when it came arrived late. Soft, obedient, but not enthusiastic. And while the program continued without further deviation, speeches given, recognitions issued, ceremonial awards passed from gloved hands to smiling dignitaries, the room was no longer merely ceremonial. It had been corrected. William finally sat. He didn't adjust his cuffs, didn't lean over to speak to Kate, didn't so much as look left or right. Because the moment didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the seat that had been taken, and then, without force, returned. The correction didn't end with Camilla's exit. Because true institutional authority doesn't end at removal, it ends at realignment. And that was exactly what was happening now. The room didn't clap when Kate sat. There was no applause for protocol doing its job. No one would dare. But something else happened. Something harder to describe. The system exhaled. Kate's presence didn't shift the spotlight. It corrected the lens. There was no nod to William. No glance of triumph. No visible acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. Because in palace choreography, acknowledging deviation makes it real. And Catherine knew better than to give it weight. She simply sat, back straight, eyes forward, hands folded lightly on her lap. The guests reoriented themselves. Not with visible movement, but with posture, with breath, with the slow uncoiling of tensions from spines that had tensed an inch too high. Even the chamber musicians resumed with more confidence. Nothing had been said, but everything had been made clear. Across the aisle, one of the diplomatic envoys, a woman who had attended 5 royal summits in the last decade, leaned slightly toward her interpreter. "Who was the guard?" she whispered. The interpreter shook her head. "Don't know." But her voice carried something like awe, because the guard had not spoken more than one sentence and had not raised his voice, had not touched anyone. And yet the energy of the entire room had obeyed him. That's not spectacle. That's authority. The first guard had returned to his position without fanfare. His posture was identical to before, ramrod straight, eyes neutral, weaponless, expression unreadable. The only difference now was that everyone in the room knew who he was. Not his name, but his role. He wasn't decoration, he wasn't background, he wasn't just ceremonial. He was structure. And the palace had just reminded itself what structure looks like when it's tested. From the dais, the king remained still. He hadn't intervened. Not because he hadn't wanted to, but because the monarchy doesn't shout over itself. It enforces itself. And if the guard had misread the situation, had overstepped or misunderstood the intent behind Camilla's placement, William would have signalled correction again. He hadn't. Which meant the action stood. The chairs in the front row were now filled. Correctly. And once again, every line matched. Back to symmetry. Back to sequence. Back to the order that makes monarchy feel inevitable. The programme resumed in full, this time with no further hitch. Presentations, diplomatic remarks, ceremonial blessings, even light applause between segments. But the atmosphere remained changed, not broken, just heavier. Because everyone in that room now understood something they hadn't quite internalized before. Protocol wasn't fragile. It was sharpened steel, and it didn't ask. It adjusted. And when it didn't need force, just alignment. No statement was issued. No explanation given. And yet, by the time the ceremony ended, the message had already echoed further than any press release ever could have reached. Camilla didn't return. She wasn't escorted from the building. She wasn't seen slipping through side halls or being rushed out the back. She simply remained absent, quietly, neatly, entirely in character with someone who would later claim the seat was taken by mistake, that she hadn't noticed the name card, that the arrangements must have been misread by staff, but no one in the room believed it had been an error. Not after the signal, not after the guard's presence, not after Catherine's entrance, and not after the second guard was summoned to realign the space in full view of diplomatic guests. The cameras never panned back to the moment. But everyone watching remembered it. In fact, they remembered it better because it wasn't replayed. Because no one explained it, it was impossible to dismiss. And within palace walls, that's often how real decisions are made, not through scandal, through order. After the ceremony, aides began to move again, not frantically, but with renewed tightness. Security rechecked exits, communications channels ran quiet, and internal press officers began preparing generic statements in case questions arose, and they never did. Not from the palace, not from Camilla's office, not from the king, because the correction had not been disputed. And therefore it stood. Kate and William did not linger. They departed without post-ceremony appearances, without engaging the crowd, without photographs. Catherine didn't need a moment of public victory. She had simply taken her seat, and now that seat belonged to her again. The guard returned to routine. His name was never printed in the next day's papers. No official recognized the gesture. But among staffers, those who operated beneath the grand optics of the crown, his action was quietly noted. A signal had been sent. A breach had been corrected. And the institution had remembered something it sometimes forgets in softer seasons. Ceremony without protocol is just performance. And protocol, once broken, if not corrected, breaks everything it touches. But today it hadn't been allowed to, because one person noticed, and one signal was given. And that was all it took. Should a silent signal ever carry more weight than a spoken command? Was the guard's action justified, or should William have handled it himself? And how often do you think protocol quietly corrects what we never hear about? Tell us what you think in the comments below. If that moment made you hold your breath, tap the like button right now. Want to see how these palace moments unfold in real time? Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story like this again. And if you know someone who still thinks seats don't matter in institutions like this, send them this video. Let them see what happens when one is taken without permission. Our best stories are already waiting on screen. Go watch them next, and we'll see you tomorrow. Same time, a brand new story.